Settle in. Let your body find that quiet rhythm, and let your mind drift with me for a while. Tonight you will step softly into a world that is long gone, and yet strangely familiar. A world of cracked stones beneath your feet, the constant murmur of voices in a language you half understand, and the faint sweetness of wine turning sour in the midday sun. You are in Rome, not the marble-clad Rome of triumphal arches and glittering temples that the guidebooks adore, but the Rome of narrow streets, chipped plaster walls, and the scent of damp wool hanging in the air. A Rome where work is constant, money scarce, and people carry on their lives quietly, without fanfare, without expectation of glory. And among these people are women whose work is whispered about, written down in moralizing tracts, and hidden behind curtained doorways. Prostitute, the registered ones, the unregistered ones, the ones who woke up each morning to do what they could to make enough to keep going. Your own room grows darker, and you run your fingers over the windowsill, feeling grooves worn into the wood by years of idle hands. Some of those hands belong to people who did the same kind of work you do now. Some left faint scratches, initials perhaps, or meaningless marks, etched during moments of waiting. You think of them briefly, the women who came before, and the thought drifts through your mind like smoke before dissolving into the stillness. There is a rhythm to the way your day unwinds. You are not expected anywhere right now. No one is calling, no one is knocking. You exist in this suspended moment between the soft gray of day and the heavy black of night. The city hums beyond your door, but it is muffled as if swaddled in thick cloth. Later you venture back into the street. The air has cooled slightly, though the stones still hold the warmth of the day. A small crowd gathers near a corner, not for anything dramatic, just watching a street performer with a tired look in his eyes. He juggles 3 stones, dropping one now, and then bending slowly to retrieve it without ceremony. The onlookers do not cheer or laugh. They watch with the same detached attention they might give to a stray cat grooming itself. You stand at the edge, arms folded, letting the faint clack of stone against stone blend with the distant sound of a cartwheel turning somewhere deeper in the city. You walk on past a bakery that has closed for the night, though the scent of bread still lingers like a ghost. The doorway is dark, the counter bare. In the alley beside it, 2 women are talking in low voices, their words spilling softly into the night, punctuated by long silences. You cannot catch the meaning. You do not need to. The cadence of their speech is enough, a slow ebb and flow that feels as old as the stones beneath you. Overhead, the laundry lines sag with damp tunics that will not dry until morning. Drops of water fall occasionally, padding softly against the stones, like a slow, irregular heartbeat. You notice a doorway with a small clay lamp flickering within. A man sits just inside his hands, busy weaving rushes into a basket. The repetitive movement is almost hypnotic, his fingers steady, even as his shoulders slump forward. A child curls against the wall behind him, eyes half-closed, thumb resting near his mouth, the day's dust still streaked on his face. This is not a scene meant for grand histories. It will never be written down in marble or ink. But it is real, quietly enduring, like so much of life here. Farther along, you pass the public latrines. The smell is sharp, but not shocking, simply part of the fabric of the city. A few men sit on the long stone benches, speaking in low tones, their voices echoing off the damp walls. You keep moving the soles of your sandals, whispering against the worn path. The rhythm steady and soft, like a lullaby drawn from stone. You find yourself near the river now. The Tiber is dark, sluggish, reflecting faint starlight. A barge creaks as it shifts with the current ropes groaning softly. You rest your hands on the rough stone of the embankment, leaning forward slightly. The water smells of mud and something metallic, and you watch as a scrap of driftwood turns lazily in the current. It is easy to imagine that piece of wood has been circling like this for years, caught in an endless loop, unnoticed and unremarkable. The river's movement is slow, unhurried, indifferent to the lives unfolding on its banks. Nearby, a group of washerwomen are finishing their day. They slap wet cloth against the stones, the sound dull and rhythmic, a counterpoint to the river's hush. Their arms move with practiced ease, though their backs are bent and their hands raw. They do not speak much. Now too tired for chatter, their movements mechanical steady. When they are done, they pack their damp bundles and walk away in single file, their sandals whispering in unison on the stones. You watch them until they vanish into the shadows and the quiet deepens. The night air grows heavier, carrying the smell of burning tallow and distant cooking fires. A dog barks once, then falls silent. From somewhere above you hear a window shutter, creak open and close again. Time here feels wide and formless, the hours melting into each other, until they are only marked by small changes in light and sound. You feel yourself slipping into that rhythm, your breathing slowing to match the city's gentle pulse. You return once more to your narrow room, climbing the same uneven steps, brushing past the same walls scrawled with half-erased marks. The room greets you as before, dim and plain, a space that belongs to you only in this fleeting moment. You sit on the edge of the straw mattress and remove your sandals, setting them carefully aside. The cool air touches your bare feet, and you rub your toes slowly against the rough weave of the mat. Outside, a single voice sings somewhere far away, a low, wavering tune that rises and falls like the river's current. You cannot tell the words, but it lingers comforting in its shapelessness. You lie back on the mattress, feeling the straw press into your back, feeling the day settle over you like another layer of dust. The ceiling above is cracked, the plaster flaking in pale curls. You trace the shapes with your eyes, letting them blur, letting your thoughts drift with them. Somewhere below, a cart rolls by the wheels, thumping softly against the stones. Then another sound, the faint chime of a distant bell marking an hour that no one here seems to care about. The sound fades, leaving only the quiet hum of night. In this moment, you realize that life here is not a collection of grand stories, but a long, slow thread of small tasks and simple gestures repeated day after day until the years themselves blur. That thought is neither sad nor comforting. It simply is. Tonight, you will not watch them with judgment or pity. You will simply observe as though through half-closed eyes, letting their world soothe you into slumber. So breathe in slowly. Feel the cobblestones underfoot. The city hums softly in the background, and together we will wander through a day that belonged to them. Imagine you have just woken up in a small upper-floor room above a tavern near the Circus Maximus. The plaster ceiling is flaking of pale dust that drifts down in lazy particles when the mule carts rattle by in the street below. Your mattress is thin, filled with tired straw that sighs when you shift your weight. You can feel the wooden slats beneath, and your back hums with a dull ache, an ache you've grown accustomed to like the steady noise of the city itself. The light here is soft and gray, not golden. Rome's dawn isn't dramatic, and as you close your eyes, you let that thought cradle you. Let the rhythm of Rome's quiet life seep into you, like a soft, heavy blanket, drawing you deeper into rest, deeper into stillness, deeper into the night. Imagine you have just woken up in a small upper-floor room above a tavern near the Circus Maximus. The plaster ceiling is flaking a pale dust that drifts down in lazy particles when the mule carts rattle by in the street below. Your mattress is thin, filled with tired straw that sighs when you shift your weight, and you feel the uneven wooden slats beneath a pressure point. Hear a creak there, and your back hums with a dull ache, an ache you have grown used to, like the steady noise of the city itself, like a companion that never quite leaves. The light here is soft and gray, not golden, because Rome's dawn isn't theatrical or romantic. It seeps in slowly through a small window, filtered through a woven reed. Blind the air carrying the faint smell of last night's lentil stew from the neighbor's hearth mixed with smoke that has long settled into the beams. A pigeon coos somewhere close by, muffled calm, rhythmic, and you lie still for a moment, listening to it, letting the day arrive at its own pace. Down in the street below, merchants are already setting up, and you hear the hollow clatter of wooden shutters being thrown open, the scrape of a heavy bucket being dragged across stone, the brief bleat of a goat tied too close to another goat, and somewhere a man mutters a curse at a mule that refuses to move. His voice is low and tired, rather than angry. A familiar tone you've heard since you first rented this cramped room. The background hum of life is constant, a tapestry of sounds woven so tightly that nothing stands out for long, and in that sound you find a strange kind of peace. You reach for a small clay jug of water, kept on a low shelf. The jug cool to the touch, rough under your fingers, where the potter's thumb left its imprint. The water tastes faintly of earth and old clay, but slides down your throat with relief, leaving you feeling a little more awake, a little more anchored in your body. Dressing is a quiet ritual, unremarkable, but necessary. Your stola is plain and coarse, a dull brown that shows the least dust and doesn't catch the eye. You pull it over your head, the fabric smelling faintly of olive oil soap that hasn't fully rinsed out stiff in places where it dried unevenly. Your sandals are stiff, leather cracked at the edges, the soles thin enough that you can feel the chill of the floor. You slip them on, slowly flexing your toes until the straps settle into familiar grooves in your skin. There is no jewelry waiting for you, no elaborate hairpiece or shimmering fabric. Those belong in the fantasies painted on the walls of the wealthy. You tie your hair back with a strip of cloth fingers, moving by habit, tugging it into a knot that will stay in place through the long hours ahead. The room itself is bare, but not empty. There is a low table scarred with old knife marks, a chipped cup, a comb missing a few teeth, and in the corner, a small lamp shaped like a duck, its spout dark with soot. You light it briefly to warm your hands, though the day is already creeping in, pale and damp. The tavern below sends up smells of baking bread, coarse and heavy, mingled with a sharper tang of cheap wine being uncorked. A voice calls out deep and friendly, greeting another worker, and you hear laughter brief hollow like the echo of something softer. You step out onto the narrow landing, the wood groaning softly underfoot, and look down the stairwell to see the innkeeper wiping down a bench with a rag that has seen better days. He glances up, nods once, and you nod back. No words are needed. Mornings here are quiet transactions of acknowledgement. The street is a ribbon of movement. You descend slowly, one hand brushing the wall for balance, and the smell of wet earth rises up to meet you. Outside, the cobblestones are uneven and slick from the night's mist, and you pause a moment, pulling your shawl tighter, feeling the rough weave against your neck. Around you, Rome wakes in layers. A boy trots past carrying a basket of figs, the purple skins glistening faintly, and a woman with a wide woven basket on her head balances it with one hand while shushing the child, tugging at her skirt. A dog wanders near the gutter, nose down tail, drooping, sniffing for scraps left from the night before. Farther away, the cries of vendors drift, like smoke selling olives, selling bread, selling the illusion that life here can be savored instead of survived. You move with the current of people, letting them flow around you, their conversations a low hum. Your path takes you past the entrance to a small shrine, the doorway dark and cool, where a few flickering oil lamps cast trembling light on clay figurines. You glance in, just briefly feeling the chill, then move on. The workday for you is not a spectacle. It is waiting often. It is arranging yourself where men will see you in the discreet corners, near the bathhouses, near the taverns, near the markets, where the air is thick with human closeness. You stand quietly not to allure, but simply to exist in a way that can be noticed. Time moves strangely here. Minutes stretch. Conversations are few, and the world moves on regardless. You notice details because you have time to notice them. The way dust gathers in the grooves of a carved column. The way the sunlight finally pierces through a gap in the rooftops and lays a bright stripe on the far wall. The slow turning of a potter's wheel in a workshop across the way, the clay glistening like wet skin under his hands. You lean against a wall and watch a child chase a loose chicken down the alley, the bird's feet slapping against stone feathers, drifting like soft gray snow. Your own stomach grumbles, but you ignore it for now, letting the rhythm of the city wash over you. There is no rush. There is never a rush. In the afternoon, you wander to a quieter street. Here the stones are narrower, the walls higher, and the air feels stiller, as if time itself hesitates. A laundry shop hums with quiet labor, women's hands wringing fabric knuckles red from lye. A pot of water steams gently in the corner, filling the air with the faint tang of wet linen. You watch them for a while, thinking of your own stola, how it will need washing soon, how the fabric never truly loses the scent of the streets, no matter how often it is scrubbed. You sit on a low step, feeling the coolness seep into your bones. The sun tilts, shadows grow longer, and the city changes its tune. Evening here is soft, not loud, not sudden. A man walks past carrying a tray of stale bread for the pigs, and you watch the crumbs fall in a little trail behind him. Somewhere a musician plucks at strings in a melancholy pattern, the notes drifting in and out of earshot as if the air itself forgets to carry them. You breathe in slowly, letting the weight of the day settle, and you think of nothing in particular, only the rhythm of life, the sameness, the quiet struggle that is both exhausting and oddly comforting. In this moment, you are not judged, you are not remembered. You simply are in a city that swallows and holds countless lives just like yours, each one flickering softly like the lamps in the shrine. And as darkness begins to creep along the street, you draw your shawl closer and rise to your feet, ready to drift back toward the tavern, where your thin mattress waits the air above, still heavy with smoke and the murmur of voices fading into night. It seeps in through a small window, diffused by a woven reed blind, the air carrying the faint scent of last night's cooking smoke from a neighbor's hearth. A pigeon coos somewhere close by. You listen for a moment. There it is, steady, predictable, somehow comforting. Down in the street, merchants are already setting up. You hear the hollow clatter of wooden shutters, opening the scrape of a bucket being dragged. Someone is cursing softly at a stubborn donkey. The words blur into the hum of background life, like the sound of traffic far away in a modern city. You reach for a small clay jug of water. It's lukewarm, tasted faintly of earth, but it will do. You sip. Your throat feels coated with dust, and the water soothes that heaviness. You dress without ceremony, just a plain stola, the fabric coarse and worn. There is no perfume, no ornament, not this early. The work you do is not glamorous, no matter what poets later imply. There are no languid luxuries, only routine. Your sandals are stiff leather cracking at the edges. You slip them on, wiggling your toes, feeling the grit caught between sole and skin. You pause, listening again, the hum of Rome swelling and softening like waves on some unseen shore. You step into the narrow passage that leads down the creaking stairs. A neighbor brushes past you, balancing a basket of laundry, her face drawn, but calm, her eyes focused only on the next step. Outside, the air tastes of smoke and damp clay. The street, is a threadbare ribbon between leaning buildings, their upper floors nearly touching. Bits of plaster cling like scabs on weathered brick. Laundry sways above dull colors' frayed edges. A stray dog noses at a heap of refuse, then retreats to a shaded doorway. You take slow steps, the ground uneven stones worn smooth by countless feet. The rhythm of your day is not dramatic, not remarkable, and yet it has a quiet texture of its own. A boy runs past with a loaf of bread tucked under his arm, and you notice the scent, warm yeast, rough flour, a crust just beginning to cool. A passing cart carries amphorae of cheap wine. One has cracked, leaving a sticky trail that gathers dust and ants. Farther along, a small shrine clings to the corner of a building, its paint faded, its offerings of wilted herbs and coin dulled by the elements. Your route takes you past the baths, though you will not enter. You hear faint splashes, laughter that drifts out and loses itself in the street noise. A seller calls out for olives, his voice hoarse, his hands stained dark from the brine. You glance into a dim doorway and see a woman mending a torn tunic, her needle moving steadily through fabric, her lips moving in some private thought or prayer. The sunlight grows stronger, but not kinder, striking the stone and making its rough surface almost shimmer. A pair of soldiers stand at a corner, bored helmets catching dull light. Their spears rest against the wall. They watch you with detached disinterest, the way someone might watch a drifting cloud. Their presence is constant, like the uneven heartbeat of this city. A beggar leans against a post, hand out face hidden by a hood. You drop a tiny copper coin without looking directly at him. You know his voice. He has been here for months, perhaps years, though time feels like a blur in a place like this. You turn toward the insula, where others like you live and work. The stairwell smells of mildew and bodies. A child sits on the steps, carving shapes into a piece of wood with a shard of metal. He looks up briefly, then returns to his quiet labor. You reach a small room at the back, a place where you sometimes rest between visitors, or where you simply sit and let time pass. On the wall, there are faint graffiti marks left by tenants, long gone scratched names, crude sketches of animals. Tally marks. The air here is thick, heavy with the residue of years of breathing and living and dying in a confined space. Later, as the day drifts, you walk again, this time past the market. The stalls are close and crowded, the air filled with the layered scents of fish, herbs, unwashed bodies, and damp straw. A seller is asleep on his stool head, nodding forward his wares, small dried figs untouched. The heat gathers between the stones and rises like breath from the earth itself. A stray cat watches from a ledge tail, flicking slowly, eyes half closed. In the corner, a woman plucks a bird slowly, methodically, feathers falling like dull snow. You think about how this city devours and renews itself, day by day, a machine that never stops. You return to your lodging in the late afternoon, the air thick and still. The sounds of the city soften into a low murmur, the light turning sallow as it slips through narrow windows. You sit by the small window looking out at a courtyard where a woman beats a rug with slow measured movements. Dust rises and hangs, catching the dying light like fine powder. Children play half-heartedly below, tossing pebbles into a broken jar. There is no laughter, only the soft clink of stone against clay. You feel the weight of the day settle into your bones, a familiar weight, not cruel, just present. You rest your head against the wall, eyes half closed, letting the hum of the city become a lullaby of its own, letting the day fade gently, as though it were never remarkable to begin with. And so the rhythm continues steady and unhurried, a pattern woven from countless such days, each blending into the next, quiet and uncelebrated. The evening creeps in slowly, not with the theatrical blaze that poets love to describe, but with a steady dimming, like someone drawing a thick curtain across the sky. You remain by the window for a while, watching the way shadows creep along the walls. A mason across the courtyard packs up his tools, stacking them neatly, even though the iron is flecked with rust. He moves slowly, his hands calloused and cracked, and you notice the way his shoulders slope forward with the weight of years. A single lantern flickers to life below, casting a pale yellow glow that barely reaches the uneven stones. You catch the scent of burning oil, faint and slightly acrid, mixing with the earthy dampness that rises as the air cools. A woman carries a pot balanced on her hip, steam curling up and vanishing into the shadows above. You can hear her humming softly, though the tune has no shape, just a rhythm to match her steps. It is not a happy song. It is not sad either. It is simply something to fill the silence that would otherwise settle too heavily. Imagine now that instead of simply drifting through the streets, you follow the faint thread of a story of one woman whose name was recorded in an old wax tablet, not because she was famous, but because someone once paid a tax on her behalf. Her name, scratched faintly in Latin letters, is Livia Prima. She was not first in anything, except perhaps the birth order in a family that could not afford to keep her. You picture her waking in a room not so different from yours, a little farther from the Circus Maximus, nearer to the Aventine Hill, in a narrow insula where the walls lean in like tired shoulders. Her room was on the 3rd floor, which meant less rent but more stairs, and in the summers the heat pooled up there like standing water. Livia's day would begin before the sun fully rose, not because she was ambitious, but because the noises made sleep fragile and easily broken. The narrow stairs creaked under her weight as she descended, her fingers trailing along the rough wall where generations of tenants had left smoothed grooves in the plaster. The tavern below was beginning to fill the sound of cups knocking against tables and the low rumble of conversation. A man at the counter wiped his hands on his apron face, gray with exhaustion, though the night was young. A pot of stew simmered behind him, sending up a faint, sour scent of cabbage and old meat. Livia paused at the doorway, letting the cooler night air touch her skin. Outside, the streets of Rome took on another life after dusk. Oil lamps flickered unevenly, their light creating pools of gold amid deep shadow. The buildings leaned in over the narrow lanes, their upper stories jutting forward like curious observers, the wood beams dark with age and soot. Livia walked without hurry, her sandals brushing against scattered straw, a rhythm that matched her heartbeat. Somewhere to her right, a musician played a soft tune on a worn lyre, the notes wandering through the air like half-remembered dreams. She turned toward the sound, not to listen closely, but simply to walk in its direction, letting it carry her along. She passed a group of women gathered near a fountain, their voices low, almost conspiratorial. They shared a loaf of bread, tearing it into rough chunks, with their hands, their laughter subdued, but genuine. Livia did not join them. She watched for a moment, then moved on. Near the fountain, the ground was slick with water, and bits of crushed herbs, the scent sharp in the cool air. A child crouched nearby, drawing patterns in the wet dust with a stick, his face, calm eyes focused. Livia smiled faintly, though the expression barely lifted the corners of her mouth, and kept walking. Sometimes she would climb a little higher up the Aventine, where the noise softened and the air smelled faintly of cypress. There were gardens there behind high walls, belonging to those who could afford privacy. Through a gap in the stone, she might catch a glimpse of dark green leaves, a shadow of a statue, or the shimmer of water in a pool. These were not for her, and she knew it, but there was no bitterness in her gaze, only a detached curiosity, like watching birds in flight, knowing you could never join them. She would sit on a low step, her hands resting in her lap, and let the city hum below her. From here, the rooftops spread out like a patchwork of dull tiles, the smoke from cooking fires rising in soft ribbons. In the distance, she could see the curve of the Circus Maximus. Dark now, the voices of the day gone. The wind carried a chill, and she pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, feeling the worn fabric scratch lightly against her skin. Memories would come unbidden at times. Of her childhood in a small village beyond the city, where the earth smelled of wheat fields and rain, where nights were quiet enough to hear insects in the grass. She remembered her mother's hands rough from labor and the way she hummed softly while mending clothes. Those memories had dulled over the years, like coins handled too many times, but they were still there, surfacing gently in moments like this. Livia let them drift through her mind without grasping at them, as one might watch leaves float by on a slow river. She returned to the streets when the air grew colder, passing by taverns, spilling out laughter and smoke, passing by doorways where shadows lingered. A man called out to her once, a half-slurred greeting, but she did not answer. She kept walking, her sandals whispering against the stones, until the familiar outline of her building rose before her. Inside the tavern was louder now, a chorus of tired voices and the smell of spilled wine. She moved past them like a shadow, climbing the stairs back to her room. There she set down her shawl and lit her lamp once more, the small flame casting a wavering light on the cracked plaster. She took out the coins again, counting them a second time, as if to reassure herself. Then carefully she slid the bronze brooch from the table and held it in her palm. It caught the lamplight faintly, the smooth edge warming under her fingers. She thought of the person who gave it to her long ago, and wondered if they still lived, or if their name too had faded into the endless roll of forgotten lives. Sometimes, before lying down, she would look out of her narrow window at the sliver of sky visible between leaning rooftops. Tonight the sky was heavy with clouds, no stars visible, only a dull silver glow where the moon tried to break through. She stood there a long while, listening to the distant clatter of a cart on cobblestones, the muffled laughter of someone far below the drip of water from a cracked gutter. Each sound was soft, layered, a lullaby woven from the fabric of the city. Then she lay down on her thin mattress, pulling the rough blanket over her shoulders. The straw beneath rustled softly as she shifted, seeking a comfortable hollow. She closed her eyes, breathing in the faint scent of the tavern stew that still hung in the air, mixed with the earthier notes of dust and smoke. Her breathing slowed. The noises outside blurred into a steady hum. And as sleep crept in, she was neither happy nor sad, neither proud nor ashamed. She was simply part of the rhythm of Rome, another quiet thread in its endless tapestry. There were nights when Livia lingered by the tavern door longer than usual, not to speak, not to join in, but simply to observe the shifting patterns of human weariness. Men hunched over their cups, elbows planted on tables, sticky with spilled wine, their voices low and slurred, not out of celebration but habit. They spoke of grain prices, of horses that limped, of landlords raising rents. Someone would always be shouting below, carrying a crate, leading a mule, arguing over fish, already turning soft in the heat. The plaster around her window was stained with years of oil smoke from the lamp she could rarely afford to fill. Sometimes she would trace shapes in the soot, absently, not thinking of anything in particular, letting her fingertip leave gray streaks on her skin. Livia's hair was dark, chopped unevenly at the shoulders, because neatness cost time and money, and she had little of either. She would dress in a faded tunic first, then wrap herself in a stola that was once green, but had become something between brown and gray, its hem frayed where it brushed against stone steps day after day. She ate little in the morning, a scrap of bread, a piece of dried fig if she was lucky. The bread was dense baked 2 days ago, and she would soften it with a little water, chewing slowly as she listened to the street below. Their words blended into a constant murmur, like the sea far off, neither soothing nor troubling, just present. She would watch the way the lamplight caught on their faces, highlighting a scar, a hollow cheek, a tired eye before it vanished into shadow again. Eventually, she would step back into the street, her sandals meeting the stone with soft, hollow sounds. The night in this quarter of Rome was not entirely safe, though Livia moved with the kind of caution that came from years of repetition. She kept to the edge of the street, brushing the walls lightly with her fingertips, feeling the texture of plaster that had been patched and repatched over decades. Every corner had its own scent. A bakery where the last bread of the day had burned slightly in the oven, a butcher stall that left a faint trace of iron in the air, a shop that sold cheap oil whose clay amphorae still exhaled their earthy perfume after closing. Sometimes she passed other women like herself, moving silently, their faces half hidden by shawls. A brief meeting of eyes was enough, a recognition of sameness, not friendship, not rivalry, just acknowledgement. One leaned against a pillar outside a shuttered shop, idly turning a piece of twine between her fingers. Another stood in a doorway, her shadow long in the lamplight, head tilted slightly, as if listening to something far away. Livia did not stop. She moved on her steps, steady, the sound of her sandals echoing faintly off the close walls. She took long routes home on certain nights, letting her thoughts drift with her pace. Past the small shrine where a single lamp burned low, its flame wavering in a draught. Past a cart whose wheel was propped up on a stone, the hub bound in rough twine, waiting for repair. Past the dark mouth of an alley where a cat watched her, silently, eyes catching the light like small coins. Each sight was ordinary, each sound a fragment of the city's quiet chorus. Back in her room, she might sit for a while before sleeping, knees drawn up, arms wrapped around them. The mattress gave slightly under her weight, the straw shifting with a soft whisper. The lamp's light painted trembling patterns on the ceiling, patterns she sometimes followed with her eyes until they blurred. On nights when she felt restless, she would take out small keepsakes she had hidden, the brooch she always kept near a scrap of cloth, embroidered with a simple flower that her mother had once stitched, a worn hair ribbon faded almost to gray. These objects were small anchors, things that reminded her she had existed in more than one place, more than one time. She would turn the brooch over in her palm, slowly feeling the smoothness worn by years of fingers. She thought of how long it had been since anyone had given her anything without expectation. It was not a sad thought, merely a fact, like the way the seasons shifted, or the way the river smelled in spring. That detachment kept her steady. She could feel the weight of her life without flinching from it, as if watching someone else's story from a slight distance. On rare occasions, a client would offer her something other than coins, a slice of bread, a bit of cheese wrapped in waxed cloth, a cheap trinket. She accepted these quietly, tucking them into her stola. Later, in the privacy of her room, she would unwrap the food, slowly savoring it, bite by bite, letting the taste linger on her tongue longer than it deserved. These small gifts felt oddly more precious than coins, though she would never say so aloud. When rent day came, she would take her coins to the landlord's wife, who handled the tenants with a brisk efficiency. The woman would count the coins twice, set them in a jar, and wave Livia off without a word. Livia never expected thanks. The exchange was purely functional. Yet she sometimes wondered about the wife, about her hands rough from scrubbing and her eyes sharp from counting, and whether she too had once stood in a street waiting for someone who might or might not come. There was a rhythm to these days that was both numbing and oddly comforting. Morning light through the reed blind, bread softened in water, coins counted and recounted, shadows stretching across uneven stones. Each repetition wore down the sharpness of memory, leaving only a smooth core. Livia rarely spoke of her past, not because it was painful, but because it was irrelevant. The city demanded Present's attention to the next step, the next hour. Even in her work, she found moments of stillness. The waiting itself was almost meditative. Standing against a wall, feeling its roughness, through her shawl, watching people pass. Noticing details, the pattern of a man's sandals, the way a child clutched a bundle of herbs, the crooked way a sign hung above a shop. Her mind would drift, her eyes half closed, until a voice drew her back. Sometimes there was conversation, brief and practical. Sometimes there was only a gesture, a nod, an exchange of coins. The bread tasted faintly of ash, but it filled the hollow in her stomach enough to begin her day. She was registered, which meant her name was written in the lists kept by the aediles. There was a tax, a small sum paid regularly, and in exchange, she was permitted to work without constant fear of arrest. It sounds official, even dignified, but in truth, it was simply another way to collect coin from those with none to spare. She would often go to the aedil's office, a small room with worn benches, and wait in line behind others like her. The room smelled faintly of sweat and ink wax tablets stacked in corners, and the clerks moved slowly, methodically scratching names and numbers with styluses barely looking up. She never made conversation. There was no need. Each woman knew the others, shared the same rhythm of life, the same weight of routine, the same mild hunger that never entirely left. Later in the day, Livia would move to a busier street. In those moments after, as she walked away, she would feel neither pride nor shame, only the simple awareness of survival. She would touch the edge of her shawl, adjusting it over her shoulder, and melt back into the slow flow of the street. There were women who spoke of leaving, of saving enough to buy a small stall in the market, or to return to a village far away. Livia did not speak of such things. Not because she lacked dreams, but because she kept them folded deep inside, like the scrap of embroidered cloth in her pouch, private and untouched. On nights when the moon was clear and full, she might linger at her window, staring at its pale glow above the rooftops. The moon looked the same over her childhood fields, the same over the city, the same over every life stacked one atop another in this vast, indifferent place. That thought calmed her. It made her small concerns seem less heavy, less urgent. The moon drifted through a thin veil of cloud, and she watched it until her eyelids grew heavy. Then she would lie down again, pulling the blanket over her shoulders, her body curling instinctively toward the wall. The straw rustled softly, the lamp guttered low, and outside the voices dwindled into distant murmurs. In that fading world, between waking and sleep, she felt herself loosen her breath, slowing the rhythms of her day, dissolving into the dark. And as the city sighed and settled into its own uneasy rest, Livia Prima joined it, another quiet heartbeat in the endless night of Rome. There were mornings when Livia woke before the city had fully stirred, not because she had to, but because her body had learned to rise with the faintest change in light. The ceiling above her was always the same, flaked and crumbling, but sometimes in that dim hour, she would study the cracks as though they formed a map only she could read. The lines curved and branched, tracing shapes that might have been rivers, or roads, or veins of some ancient creature sleeping within the plaster. It was a quiet game she played with herself before her feet even touched the floor. The sound of a broom sweeping in the street below would reach her rhythmic steady. She would picture the street sweeper moving slowly, pushing dust into piles, his tunic hanging loosely, his sandals scuffing stone. She had never spoken to him, but after so many mornings, his presence felt like part of her own routine. A man she would never know yet relied on without question. That thought made her smile faintly, though the smile faded as quickly as it came. She would move through the small tasks of the morning fingers, deftly tying her hair back, smoothing her stola, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders as she opened her door to the world. The stairwell always smelled faintly of vinegar and smoke, the remnants of meals, cooked in cramped rooms of lamps left burning too long. A neighbor's door might open as she descended, revealing an old woman cradling a bundle of firewood, her eyes tired but sharp. A soft nod would pass between them, a greeting too familiar to require words. On the street, the city revealed itself layer by layer. A cart rattled past the wheels, squealing against stone, and she stepped aside to let it pass, feeling the breeze it carried brush her cheek. A boy ran by carrying a bundle of greens, his bare feet slapping the ground with quick light sounds, a rhythm that lingered in the air even after he had vanished around a corner. She noticed how the early sun caught the rooftops, how it turned broken tiles into dull glints, how it made the air seem less heavy, even if the heat was already gathering. There were small shrines tucked into corners where she sometimes paused not to pray exactly, but to stand in the presence of stillness. A clay figure of a household god sat within one, its surface worn smooth by countless touches. Someone had left a sprig of rosemary there, its scent faint but enduring. Livia would glance at it, her expression unreadable, and move on her steps, steady and unhurried. As the day lengthened, her path would lead her toward the baths again, toward the corners where men passed by with coins to spare. She would lean against a wall and let her thoughts drift, noticing the rhythm of feet against stone, the murmur of conversations. Her work required patience more than anything else, and she had learned to find a kind of strange comfort in waiting. Sometimes she would watch a man approaching from a distance, see his shadow stretch across the stones before he reached her, and already know whether he would stop or pass. These instincts were not sharp or anxious. They were calm, honed by repetition, softened by resignation. When the coins came, they were tucked into her cloth pouch without ceremony. She did not count them immediately. There was time enough for that later in the privacy of her room when the city grew quieter. Until then, she simply let them rest against her hip, a reassuring weight as she moved through the hours. There was a corner near the baths of Caracalla, where men often lingered tired from the hot rooms, skin still damp from the steam hair, smelling faintly of rosemary oil. She would stand there quietly, leaning against a stone wall, darkened by years of smoke and rain. Her eyes would wander across the crowd, never resting long, scanning faces without expectation. Some men would glance her way, and then look quickly back to the street. Some would approach. Some would mutter a few words, and then change their mind. The hours stretched long, the sun shifted slowly, and her feet would ache in her thin sandals. The money was never much. A few coins, tarnished and uneven, passed from hand to hand. She would keep them tucked into a small cloth bag tied at her waist, fingers brushing them now and then, as if to reassure herself they were real. On certain days, she would buy a small treat of fig, if they were cheap enough, or a handful of roasted chickpeas wrapped in a scrap of parchment. She would eat slowly, savoring each bite, letting the flavor linger as she leaned in the shade of a narrow archway. The heat of the day would press against her skin, but the shadow felt cool enough. She would close her eyes for a moment, listening to the sound of a distant hammer striking metal in a blacksmith's shop. The rhythm was steady, a dull thud followed by a pause, then another thud over and over like a heartbeat. Evenings sometimes brought brief conversation. Another woman younger might join her on a quiet stretch of street. They would speak softly, sharing small details, how many coins had been earned, where a kind client might be found, which a dial was stricter this month. Their words carried no intimacy, only the quiet exchange of information necessary for survival. Yet there was something human in it, something that warmed the edge of the night. Afterward, Livia would walk alone again, passing beneath balconies draped with hanging linens that swayed in the evening breeze. The fabrics were rough-patched many times, their colors faded to shades of earth and stone. She would glance upward, wondering briefly about the lives inside, about the meals being eaten, the conversations whispered in the dark. These thoughts drifted like smoke, lingering only until the next turn of the street. Sometimes, if she was not too tired, she would climb the external stairs of her building, slowly pausing on each landing to catch her breath and look out over the street. From above, the city seemed smaller. Its noise softened, its movements less frantic. Lamps flickered below, casting long shadows that stretched like dark rivers across the stones. The air smelled faintly of smoke and distant cooking fires, a familiar blend that spoke of countless households carrying on the same rituals. In her room, the night would settle around her like a worn blanket. The lamp on her table flickered low, casting light that trembled with each draft. She would loosen her stola and fold it carefully, setting it aside with deliberate motions, as though each movement could anchor her in the moment. Her fingers would brush the brooch once more, feeling its cool weight, and then she would place it back in its safe spot. Before lying down, she sometimes sat cross-legged on the mattress, leaning her back against the wall, her eyes half closed. The sounds outside blurred into a low hum, distant laughter, the shuffle of feet, the occasional cry of a night bird. Her own breathing was steady, slow, and she would rest her hands on her knees, feeling the tension of the day ebb away. There was no grand meaning in her life, no dramatic arc. There was only the repetition of days, the soft accumulation of small actions that together kept her alive. When sleep came, it was not sudden but gradual, like the slow dimming of an oil lamp. Her thoughts wandered gently from the memory of a boy's bare feet on the stones to the pattern of cracks on her ceiling, from the sound of sweeping in the morning to the faint scent of rosemary left at a shrine. And in that wandering, she felt herself dissolve into the rhythm of the city, into the quiet chorus of countless others doing the same, until the night folded her gently into rest. At the end of the day, when the shadows lengthened and the streets emptied, she would walk home slowly, passing by the market stalls as they closed, watching the vendors sweep away bits of wilted herbs and fish scales glinting faintly in the fading light. Back in her room, she might light her lamp if there was oil left. The small flame would flicker against the cracked wall, casting soft, uneven shapes. She would sit cross-legged on her mattress, counting the coins, carefully setting aside enough for rent, enough for bread, enough for the tax. There was little left for anything else. Sometimes she would run her fingers over the edge of an old bronze brooch she had kept from her childhood, the one possession that had no price because she would never sell it. It was shaped like a leaf, the detail worn smooth, and she would hold it quietly, feeling the cool metal against her palm. When sleep came, it came slowly. The sounds of the city would still drift in the distant laughter of drinkers, the dull thud of a cartwheel hitting a rut, the murmur of voices carrying through thin walls. But eventually her body would give in, and she would curl on her side, her breath steady, her mind quiet, another day behind her, and another waiting when dawn crept in again. Livia's visits to the Aedile's office were quiet affairs. The building itself was unremarkable. Stone walls stained with damp, a wooden door whose hinges groaned each time it opened. Inside, benches lined the room, women seated with eyes downcast waiting. A scribe sat at a table, worn smooth by years of elbows and quills, dipping a stylus into ink and scratching slowly at a tablet. The sound was steady, dry, almost soothing in its repetition. One by one, the women approached, murmured names, handed over coins, and left. No one lingered. The air was thick with the smell of old paper wax and bodies standing too close for too long. Livia would shift her weight from one foot to another, feeling the roughness of her sandals against her heels, until her turn came. The transaction was brief. Her name, her payment, her departure. Outside, the street felt brighter by comparison, though the sky was the same pale gray. At the baths, the atmosphere was different, humid, thick, filled with murmurs and the occasional splash of water. The stone walls glistened with condensation, the air heavy with the sense of oil sweat and herbs. Men drifted in and out, some speaking in low tones, others silent, their faces unreadable. Livia would position herself just beyond the main entrance, where the shadows pooled, Her presence was neither hidden nor announced. She simply stood, leaning lightly against the stone, watching the flow of people with the detached patience of someone accustomed to waiting. Her eyes would rest briefly on the tiles underfoot, noticing the worn patterns, the chips, where countless sandals had passed. A breeze might drift through, stirring the edge of her stola, and she would adjust it absently, her fingers brushing the frayed hem. Evenings on the Aventine Hill carried their own rhythm. As the day ended, the sky deepened into a muted blue, the light slipping behind rooftops. Livia would walk home slowly, passing by the last vendors, packing away wilted greens, sweeping seeds and dirt from their stalls. The air smelled faintly of crushed herbs and old smoke. She would pause at a corner to watch the shadows lengthen the lamplight, flickering in narrow doorways. It was not beautiful, not in the way poets describe, but there was a softness to it, a kind of resignation that made everything feel slower, less sharp. Back in her room, she would count coins by lamplight, her face calm, almost expressionless, the way someone looks when they have done the same action so many times that it no longer carries meaning. She would arrange them in small piles, her hands moving slowly, deliberately. Outside, the voices softened the city's heartbeat, slowing for the night. She might set the bronze brooch on her palm, trace its smooth edge with her thumb, and place it carefully back on the table. There was no ceremony, no drama, only the quiet continuation of survival. And so the night would deepen, the lamp flicker, and Livia's breathing would slow. In the stillness, the city seemed to fold in on itself, drawing all its weary souls into a shared quiet. The rhythm of her life was not dramatic, not legendary, but steady, patient, and enduring, a rhythm that carried her gently into sleep, just as you might feel yourself, drifting now, held by the soft repetition of lives long past. Livia's evenings were rarely her own, though she moved through them as if they were. After counting her coins and setting them aside, she might leave her room again, not for work this time, but simply because the air indoors felt too heavy, too close. The night wind curls softly through the half-unearthed walls, brushing loose grains of soil into tiny spirals. You remain seated on the low stone, letting your hand rest against the coarse surface, feeling the way time has roughened it, worn it until it feels more like sand than rock. Around you, the ruins breathe quietly, a small shift of earth, a faint tick as something cools in the evening air, a thread of wind whistling through a hollow niche. By day, these ruins are studied, labeled, measured, turned into diagrams that flatten their living memory. But at night, they stretch into something deeper. You imagine layers beneath layers, each telling a different part of the same ordinary story. A shard of pottery at your feet, once held olive oil poured carefully by hands. Long vanished, a broken tile near your elbow, once supported the footsteps of women moving quietly down a corridor. Heads bent, shawls drawn tight against the cold. Its edge is sharp, the curve smooth, and as you hold it in your palm, you imagine the vessel it once belonged to. Perhaps a bowl used every morning, perhaps a jar that once held oil, now long evaporated. These fragments feel strangely alive in your hand, not because they speak, but because they have absorbed so much quiet routine. You carry the shard a few steps, then set it gently back where you found it, as though returning something borrowed. Farther along, you find a hollow that might have been a hearth. The stones are blackened, crumbling, their edges crisscrossed with cracks like parched skin. You kneel beside it and close your eyes, listening with your imagination for the sound of wood, snapping of embers shifting, of someone breathing a soft sigh as she warms her hands. You can almost taste the smoke on the air, that dry, bitter tang that clings to hair and cloth long after the fire dies. The ruins around you begin to feel less like remnants and more like sleeping creatures, each stone holding within it a pulse of memory. You picture narrow rooms filled with the rustle of stola fabric, with whispers exchanged between women about prices, about neighbors, about aches in the back that never go away. You picture small gestures that no one thought to record, like someone smoothing her hair before stepping into the street, or folding a piece of cloth twice, just to fit it neatly on a shelf. The mysteries in these ruins are not grand ones, not tales of emperors or battles, but quieter ones who scratch these lines into the plaster, who press this token into the earth, who stood in this very spot when the air was thick with the scent of cooking and the chatter of children. You step carefully over a beam, half buried in the soil, its surface splintered, softened by age, and you wonder what roof it once held. Maybe it covered a room so small you could cross it in 3 steps. Maybe it sheltered someone's sleep on a night heavy with rain. Now it lies still, returning slowly to earth, its purpose fulfilled long ago. The darkness deepens and you sense the city. Beyond the dig site settling too, the modern lights far away, blinking like tired eyes. You imagine all the people sleeping in their rooms above, unaware of the layers of lives beneath them, unaware that under their beds and walls lie pieces of Livia's world. The thought comforts you that these lives continue quietly, unaware yet connected. You move to another corner where stones form the outline of a narrow alley, and you picture it filled again, the slap of sandals, the trickle of dirty water running between them, the faded banners hanging overhead, advertising services now forgotten. You imagine a woman leaning in a doorway, arms crossed, watching the day unfold the same way you sit, watching the past unfold. These imaginings do not tire you. They soothe you, each thought slow and deliberate like breathing. You crouch near another shallow trench and see a fragment of glass, cloudy and green, perhaps once part of a flask or a small window. You hold it up to the moonlight, and it catches a faint glow, a soft shimmer that feels like a secret shared only with you. The glass is cool, smooth on one side, pitted on the other, and you marvel at its endurance. Surviving storms quakes countless feet pressing above it. You think of Livia again, of her hands handling something similar, pouring water into a vessel, watching the way light bent through it, not knowing that centuries later, someone would stand in the dark and think of her. A faint breeze rises, carrying with it the scent of earth dry and ancient, and you close your eyes, letting it wash over you. In that moment, the ruins feel less like a place and more like a presence vast and quiet, enfolding you. You stay still, listening, breathing, imagining, until time itself seems to blur, until the ruins are not only beneath you, but around you, alive again in soft murmurs and distant footsteps. The mysteries remain unsolved, and that is what makes them gentle. They are not demands, not puzzles that need answers, but companions in thought, whispering softly as the night deepens, inviting you to rest within their endless patience. You stay there a long while, shifting your weight from one foot to the other, letting the night settle further. And you begin to wander again, among the darkened outlines of old walls and forgotten thresholds. Your pace slow, your steps careful as though you might disturb someone, still sleeping beneath the soil. The air thick with that particular smell of earth that has been hidden too long from the sun. A smell that carries both dryness and a faint metallic tang, as if history itself has a scent. You pass a corner where the base of a column still stands, its surface chipped, but still showing the ghost of a carved pattern. A curling leaf that once formed part of a larger design, and you think about the hand that carved it, about how he might have paused to flex his fingers after hours of chiseling, maybe wiping sweat from his brow with the back of his hand, perhaps muttering softly about the quality of the stone or the payment promised by some distant overseer. In the dark, the column becomes more than stone. It becomes a quiet witness, having seen countless feet pass, countless shadows shift. You imagine Livia walking by at once, glancing at the carved leaves without much thought. Her mind on something else, perhaps, on the coins she had or didn't have, perhaps, on a lamp that needed oil, perhaps on nothing at all. And here you are centuries later, looking at the same curling design, and in that small shared gaze you feel time fold gently. You continue on, finding what might have been a stairway, just the lower steps remaining, each worn smooth and hollowed in the center. And you picture women climbing these steps in the dim light of early morning shawls, wrapped tight holding clay lamps, their eyes heavy with lack of sleep, their minds already counting the day ahead. You think of how many feet it takes to shape stone like that, how many small lives had to pass in repetition to create such visible wear, and you feel an odd tenderness for those anonymous steps. The wind shifts, carrying a new scent, faint, but present, the scent of some herb still growing among the cracks. Maybe wild thyme, maybe something seeded by accident long ago, and it mingles with the dust in a way that feels both ancient and fresh. You kneel and brush aside a bit of soil, revealing a shard with a faint painted line, still visible, and you imagine the vessel, whole its surface, once alive with color, held in someone's hands as they poured a thin stream of oil into a lamp, watching the pool rise slowly to the brim. That act would have been ordinary, performed without thought, yet the shard remains long after the hand has vanished, long after the lamp itself crumbled. You hold it, then place it carefully back where you found it, as though leaving it in the same silence in which it waited for you. Moving on, you reach a stretch where the ground is uneven, marked by depressions that might have been post holes, and you pause to imagine wooden beams rising from them, forming walls, forming shelter, forming spaces that once contained warmth and voices. You think of Livia, sitting in such a room, perhaps on a low stool, perhaps listening to rain striking the roof. Tiles, perhaps smoothing her shawl with slow hands. These thoughts bring no sadness, only a kind of distant empathy, as though you and she are both caught in the same quiet night. Beyond the post holes lies a scatter of iron nails, rusted to flakes, but still shaped enough to hint at the carpentry they once joined. You crouch and touch one, lightly feeling its roughness, thinking of the sound it made when first driven into wood, the resistance of grain, the solid satisfaction of joining one thing to another. That satisfaction is gone, the structure long since fallen, but the nail remains stubborn in its decay, holding on to the memory of usefulness. You walk further until the ruins begin to thin the outlines, fading into open ground, and you stop where a wall ends abruptly. The edge jagged, the stones tumbled outward, and you look beyond it to the faint glow of the modern city. Far off the lights, like low stars, and you think of how many layers lie between that glow and this darkness. People live unaware above all this, walking streets, built over old streets, placing their furniture over what were once small kitchens, narrow courtyards, rented rooms like Livia's. You breathe slowly, letting that thought fill you, the weight of the present, pressing down gently on the past, and the past rising like faint smoke through the cracks of memory. You imagine archaeologists here years ago, bending over the ground in early morning light, their brushes moving carefully, their notebooks filling with numbers, their voices low and steady, and you imagine them pausing, sometimes lost in the same thoughts. You're now about the hands that once shaped these things, about the small acts that built and rebuilt this city. You sense how every inch of this earth has been touched, stepped on, leaned against, how nothing here is untouched by human presence, and that awareness feels strangely comforting, as if solitude itself is shared. A few paces away lies a stretch of floor mosaic, its pattern only partly visible. Dirt and moss have crept over it, dulling its colors, yet some of the small tiles still gleam faintly when the moonlight catches them. You lean closer, tracing the design, with your eyes a curling vine, a fragment of a bird's wing, the faint outline of a jug. Perhaps this room was once a private chamber. Perhaps someone like Livia sat here smoothing her stola, thinking about the next hour, unaware that the pattern beneath her feet would outlast her by centuries. You imagine the air then thick with smoke from nearby hearths, the low crackle of wood, the muted sound of sandals on stone, the faint laughter drifting in from the street below the rhythm of daily life, so steady that no one thought to record it in detail. The earth holds these things quietly without drama, and as you sit there, you can almost feel the press of those lives, not as ghosts, but as soft impressions like footprints in damp sand. A faint sound drifts across the night. Maybe a dog barking far away, maybe a cart's wheel squealing against stone, and it blends with the imagined sounds of the old city, so that for a moment you cannot tell which belongs to now and which to then. You close your eyes and let both exist together, the layers of time folding into each other, like fabric soft and worn. When you open them again, the darkness has deepened and the ruins feel closer, as though leaning in to hear your breath. You step back toward the well you saw earlier, tracing your fingers along the rim, feeling the grooves carved by rope over years, and you imagine drawing up a bucket, feeling its weight, hearing the creak of the wood, tasting the coolness of the water in a chipped cup. You stay with that image for a long moment, savoring the imagined relief it brings, and then you straighten, breathing in the night air that carries with it both the past and the present. The mysteries here do not shout. They murmur, and you realize you could listen forever without needing an answer. You turn slowly, walking back the way you came, your steps careful, your eyes adjusting to the shadows. And with every step, you feel yourself sinking deeper into a calm that seems to rise from the ground itself. A calm born of centuries of repetition, of lives lived quietly, of histories left in fragments that now cradle you gently as you move among them. You know you will return to your own bed soon, but for now you let the stillness carry you. Each breath slower than the last, each thought softer, until the ruins themselves feel like a lullaby sung in stone and dust and air. A little farther down the slope, you see the outline of what once was a small courtyard, the shape marked by shallow trenches and broken walls, and in its center, the remains of a well stones stacked neatly, still holding their place. You imagine women lowering buckets, pulling them up with slow, even effort, the creak of rope, the splash of water spilling over the rim, the smell of damp earth rising from below. Someone might have leaned on that well's edge to rest her arms, gazing idly at the pale sky above, thinking about what to cook, what debt to pay, who to wait for. Now all that remains is a circle of stone, and the memory of weight, of motion, of small struggles repeated endlessly. Your hand brushes over another fragment, a rim of a cup still smooth to the touch, and you wonder whose lips met it, whether it held watered wine or plain water, whether it was passed around between friends or left forgotten on a shelf. Every object seems ordinary, yet in the hush of the night, each becomes monumental, because it has carried the intimacy of human use. The archaeologists who came here cataloged each piece, drawing neat lines in notebooks, labeling them with numbers, but they could not capture the warmth of breath, the sound of footsteps, the feeling of rough cloth against skin. You close your eyes and let those sensations build softly in your mind, not as bright images, but as muted impressions, like seeing through layers of gauze. There are theories about these quarters, about how the lower rooms of Insulae might have been used, about which were rented by merchants, which by those like Livia, who lived at the edges of recorded history, but no certainty remains. That uncertainty is a comfort in its own way, because it allows you to imagine freely without breaking the calm of the moment. You picture a corridor lined with oil lamps, their light dim but steady shadows of figures moving along the walls, their conversations low and practical. You imagine the sound of dripping water, somewhere unseen, the faint tang of iron from tools, left leaning against a doorframe, the coo of a pigeon nesting in a cracked lintel. All these sounds weave together into a steady rhythm that could lull anyone into stillness. A fragment of painted plaster lies nearby, showing just enough color to hint at what was once a vivid scene. Perhaps a small bird perched on a reed, perhaps a cluster of grapes rendered with patient strokes, and you marvel at how even in these quarters there was once a desire for decoration, for beauty, however simple. Time has stripped it almost bare, yet not entirely, as though refusing to erase the touch of those anonymous hands. As you move slowly through the ruins, careful not to disturb the soil, you find yourself imagining the meals cooked here, the bread baked on flat stones, the steam rising into the air. You can almost smell the smoke clinging to the walls, almost hear the sound of grinding grain in a hand mill, the low hum of voices talking of nothing in particular. These are not dramatic images, not tales of glory or tragedy, but they are steady and real, and they hold you in a kind of quiet spell. You pause near a stone threshold worn smooth in the center from countless feet, and stand there picturing all those who crossed it, each with their own thoughts, their own burdens, their own fleeting joys. The night deepens, the air cools further, and the ruins seem to settle around you, as if the ground itself exhales. You feel the weight of time not as a threat, but as a comfort, like a heavy blanket pressed gently over you. In these moments, the mysteries are not puzzles to solve, but soft currents to drift in, letting them carry you through centuries without urgency. The dig site fades from sight as darkness gathers, but the shapes remain in your mind, layered and endless, the quiet lives of those who came before, blending with your own breath until it feels like you are part of them, and they somehow are part of you. You stay seated a while longer, feeling the coolness of the stone seep into your palm and into the thin soles of your sandals, and the night air drapes over your shoulders like a heavy shawl. The ruins around you are not silent exactly, but their sounds are soft, the kind you only notice when you have stopped speaking and let your thoughts slow down. Somewhere to your left, a loose fragment shifts with the wind, a dry scrape against another stone, and you let that sound settle into you, memorizing its texture. You think of how many layers lie beneath you, still layers that will never be touched by a trowel or brushed free by careful hands. The ground is too deep, the city has grown too heavy above it, and so thousands of moments remain pressed flat beneath centuries of stone and soil, invisible, yet oddly present. You picture a jar buried with its lid still intact, the grain inside turned to dust, but shaped exactly as it was poured, frozen in time. You imagine a pair of wooden sandals, long since rotted, yet their imprint remaining faintly in a layer of compacted clay. No one will ever see them yet. They exist folded into the earth's memory, like words written in a secret language. You move a little, shifting your weight, and your gaze drifts to a stretch of wall where the plaster is stained darker than the rest. Perhaps water once dripped here, or perhaps smoke gathered in a corner where a lamp burned too long. You run your fingers lightly over the roughness, and in your mind's eye you see someone doing the same centuries ago, perhaps pausing between tasks, perhaps lost in thought, perhaps simply leaning there to rest aching feet. The wall holds no image, no inscription yet. It hums with the memory of touch. You stand and wander slowly toward the shadow of a fallen archway. The keystone lies half buried, its carved detail almost gone, but you can still make out the curve of a vine etched by some patient hand. You think about that artisan bent over his work chisel, tapping softly, unaware that his labor would endure longer than the building it adorned. The thought is both humbling and oddly soothing, as if reminding you that not every act needs an audience to matter. Beyond the archway lies a patch of ground littered with shards of red clay. They crunch faintly under your foot, and you stop crouching to pick one up, As you leave the ruins in your mind and drift upward toward the imagined hills, the rhythm of Rome shifts almost imperceptibly. The stones smoother beneath your feet, the air touched with a faint perfume from gardens tucked behind high walls, and you begin to notice how the world of the elite was built only a few winding streets away from the cramped quarters you wandered earlier. You walk slowly up a gradual incline, picturing wide doorways framed by polished marble columns, their surfaces still cool in the early night, the pattern of the veining soft under your fingertips, if you cared to touch it, and above those doorways, carved lintels still sharp despite centuries of wind and sun. Inside, you imagine courtyards open to the sky, a square of stars framed by carefully cut stone, and a shallow pool reflecting wavering lantern light, the faint plink of a drop of water falling from some hidden spout. You picture a patrician woman reclining on a couch in a private chamber, her stola woven of linen so fine it barely holds its shape. Her sandals bound with soft leather straps that leave no marks on her ankles, and she lifts a cup of watered wine, tasting it slowly as she listens to the murmur of her household, perhaps thinking idly of the games in the amphitheater of the gossip. Whispered in the marketplace of the names carved on tablets, recording taxes she herself never touches. You let the image linger, and then you step back in thought, past the carved doorways and into the servants' quarters, where shadows stretch longer, where the air is thicker and the walls are plain, and you see those same hands that smoothed her couch, now working over a pot of stew, stirring carefully, measuring by habit, not by scale, thinking not of leisure but of the next errand, the next task, the next hour. The contrast is not violent, not even sharp, but steady, like a change in texture beneath your fingertips. You walk further, seeing a young boy practicing his declensions, his voice steady, patient, and then you think of the children in the lower streets shouting not words from books, but quick bargains over fruit, their learning tied to survival rather than verse. You imagine the villas on the Palatine Hill walls, rising high rooms adorned with imported marbles, long tables laden with meats, sauces rich and dark. Yet even there the night carries the same chill, the lamps smoke the same, the wind rustles the same across the tiles as it does over the poorest roof. You picture a senator adjusting his toga as he listens to the dull scrape of his scribes preparing documents. And then a few streets away, you picture Livia adjusting her worn shawl, listening to the scrape of her own sandals on uneven stone. And you realize how both gestures are small, both gestures are forgotten, both gestures melt into the same rhythm of the city. You imagine a moment in the villa when the air is so still you can hear the drip of water in the courtyard, and you place beside it a moment in a cramped insula when the air is thick and someone lies awake hearing the drip of water from a cracked pipe, and the sameness of those sounds is strangely comforting. You walk mentally through a storeroom lined with amphorae, sealed with wax, the smell of olive oil and grain filling the air. And then you imagine the little storerooms in the streets below, where scraps are stored in clay bowls, where the same smell of oil clings faint but familiar. The contrast becomes not so much about wealth as about scale, about how the same acts eating, mending, resting repeat in every level of the city with different trappings. You move on, picturing a dining room where the conversation turns to politics, to alliances, to the shifting currents of power. And then you picture a tavern below, where conversation turns to the price of bread, to the landlord's temper, to the ache in someone's legs. Both are talk, both are survival, both are carried by voices that fade into the night when the lamps are put out. The thought is soothing, like listening to overlapping songs in different keys that somehow harmonize. You imagine the elite reclining on cushioned couches, lulled by the faint scent of imported incense. And then you see in your mind Livia resting on her straw mattress, lulled only by exhaustion and the distant coo of pigeons, and yet both close their eyes against the same darkness, both breathing under the same Roman sky. You step back further still, letting the city as a whole fill your mind, from the marble temples gleaming faintly in moonlight down to the shadowed alleys damp with spilled water. And you feel how the contrast is softened by distance, how all of it together forms the heartbeat of a city that does not remember names, only patterns. You picture a wealthy man strolling his peristyle garden, trailing his hand over the leaves of a laurel tree, feeling their smoothness. And then you picture Livia trailing her hand over a rough wall, feeling the plaster crumble under her fingers. And somehow those two sensations meet in your imagination, like two notes of the same melody. You imagine the hush before dawn in the upper quarters, when the household sleeps, and the night lamps flicker low, and you pair it with the hush before dawn in the crowded streets, when even the taverns quiet, and only a few footsteps echo. That parallel soothes you, softens the edges between classes, reminds you that all lives share the same silences. You see in your mind the grand triclinium, with bronze lamps casting steady light, and then see the narrow upper room where a single wick burns low in a clay holder, both flickers trembling in unseen drafts, both holding back the dark, just enough for someone to see their own hands. You think of banquets where honeyed dates are served on silver trays, and then think of Livia breaking her coarse bread, slowly dipping it into watered wine. And the contrast is gentle, not cruel, just real, a testament to the variety of existence that all flows into the same river of time. You sit longer with these thoughts, feeling them grow softer, heavier, like a blanket laid over your shoulders, and you realize that the city itself has always been a cradle of opposites. Wealth and want, comfort and struggle, silence and noise. But in the stillness of night, all those opposites dissolve into a steady hum. A song of lives layered and fading. A song you can feel in your chest if you sit quietly enough. You let yourself breathe deeply, inhaling the scent of imagined laurel and distant smoke and damp stone, exhaling slowly until your shoulders drop, until your heartbeat slows to match the rhythm of those quiet lives. The city rests now in your mind as one whole, high and low, bright and dim, and you rest with it, lulled by the thought that even those who lived in shadow were part of something vast. Even those who dined under golden ceilings were in the end folded into the same soil, and the contrast that once felt sharp is now nothing more than a gentle echo fading into the night. You remain on that imagined step, letting the contrast roll over you in quiet waves, and after a time, you rise again in your mind and walk through another villa that rises somewhere above the dark tangle of narrow streets. A villa where a large doorway opens onto a hall lined with statues of ancestors whose eyes seem to watch even in shadow. Their faces carved with calm dignity, their marble brows catching the faint shimmer of lamplight. You trail your fingers along the edge of a marble table and feel how smooth it is compared to the rough wood Livia might rest her hand upon at night, and you imagine the sound of wine being poured into glass so thin it sings when tapped, and then you hear in your memory the duller sound of wine sloshing into a clay cup. Its rim chipped, its surface gritty, and the two sounds blend in your ears until you can no longer tell which belongs to wealth and which to want. You wander further and enter a room where a scribe sits cross-legged, copying texts with deliberate patience, the stylus scratching softly on wax, and you think of the women in the streets who know no letters, who read only the tone of a voice, the curve of a hand gesture, and yet both forms of reading carry meaning. Both are ways to move through the world. You look up and see a ceiling painted with scenes of myth, a procession of figures frozen mid-gesture robes, flowing faces serene, and you think of the ceilings in cramped rooms, flaking plaster revealing old repairs. Yet those rough ceilings also tell stories. If you look closely, cracks, branching like rivers, stains marking old leaks. Each flaw a chapter in the life of that room, You step into a colonnaded garden where the night air feels softer, where the shadows of cypress trees fall in long shapes across the tiled ground, and you imagine a man pacing here in thought, debating the future of Rome in his mind. And then you picture Livia walking slowly back to her room, her steps deliberate as she counts her coins, debating not the fate of an empire, but the fate of her own next meal. And somehow those two worries feel linked, both born of living within the currents of a restless city. The air smells different here, heavier with the sweetness of crushed laurel leaves, and distant kitchens roasting meats that most people in the streets below might only smell but never taste. The floors are tiled in mosaics, whole and unbroken, smooth beneath sandaled feet, and you see the footprints of household slaves padding quietly through shadowed corridors, carrying trays with careful hands, their movements practiced and unobtrusive. You picture a woman of wealth reclining on a low couch, the fabric beneath her rich and dyed, deep her bracelets catching the flicker of the lamps, as she turns her wrist to pluck a fig from a shallow dish, her mind perhaps wandering through idle thoughts as she listens to a poet reciting verses in the next room, his voice steady and unhurried, the words spilling like warm honey in the heavy air. You continue and find yourself in a storage room of the villa, lined with amphorae, marked carefully with wax seals, each labeled with neat symbols for oil, for grain, for wine, and you think of the small jars in the lower streets, unmarked, holding whatever could be saved, and you realize both are gestures of preservation, both acts of care in their own way. You imagine the villa's kitchen, where fish sizzles on a brazier, herbs thrown in with a practiced hand, the rich smell filling the air. And then imagine the tavern's kitchen with its heavy pot of cabbage and beans simmering slowly. The scent earthier, sharper, but just as nourishing to those who gather around. You move to another room where the villa's mistress sits at a table sorting through fabrics, smooth linen and bright wool from distant lands. And you picture Livia mending the edge of her stola with clumsy stitches, drawing the needle through thick cloth, squinting in the poor light. And yet both acts are about maintaining what one has, about stretching the life of a garment as far as it will go. You wander through the imagined villa until you reach a balcony that overlooks the city, the air cool and faintly perfumed by night flowers in pots. And from here you can see the glow of countless lamps below, a constellation of ordinary lives twinkling faintly, and you imagine the woman on the balcony watching those lights without really thinking of them, unaware of the rooms hidden behind each glow, unaware of the quiet routine beneath. And you realize that Livia too might once have looked up toward these heights, her own lamp flickering in the darkness, wondering vaguely what it would be like to live behind those high walls, and then shrugging the thought away as she returned to her bread, her coins, her straw mattress. You let that dual image settle in your mind, two women separated by walls and wealth, both breathing the same night air, both thinking their own private thoughts, both unnoticed by history, except as faint shadows glimpsed in records or ruins. The more you dwell on it, the softer the contrast becomes, like ink bleeding gently across old parchment, until it is no longer about envy or privilege, but simply about the wide range of human existence folded into the same place. You keep walking in your mind, passing through one last wide hall lined with bronze lamps, and you notice how the shadows cluster in the corners, despite the light, how even here there are patches of darkness untouched, and you think of the dark corners in narrow insulae where lamps barely glow, and the similarity feels comforting, a reminder that no light is complete and no shadow is unique. You step outside and walk down the slope again, past the guarded gates and the stone posts, past the merchants' stalls, now closed, past the faint smell of old cooking fires, and as you descend the streets, narrow, and the stones become uneven, and soon you are once more in the world where Livia lived, where a single window glows softly behind a shutter, where someone shifts in their sleep on straw, where a jar of water sits on a shelf ready for morning. You pause in that imagined street, letting the weight of the hill behind you and the weight of the rooms ahead of you blend into one, and you feel yourself carried by the quiet knowledge that both worlds are gone, now both dissolved into the same earth, and yet both linger in the stones, in the shards, in the faint lines on ancient walls, waiting to be felt by anyone who walks slowly enough, listens carefully enough, breathes deeply enough to hear the heartbeat of a city that never truly sleeps. And you stand there, eyes half closed, your breath slow and even, and you feel a calm wash over you, as if those countless lives, high and low, rich and poor, loud and quiet, have gathered around you in silence, holding you in the same timeless rhythm that soothed them long ago. You walk further into this imagined domus, noting the polished bronze mirrors leaning on low tables, the soft rustle of woven curtains shifting as the breeze moves through the inner courtyard, and you think of how very far this life is from the one you traced in the ruins, though the distance is measured in only a few streets. The same city holds them both layered, not in miles, but in fortunes and privileges that feel almost invisible to those who have them. You pause near an imagined atrium, the roof open to the night, rainwater collected in a square basin, the reflection of the moon shimmering on its surface, and you picture a slave kneeling to clean the tiles, his hands moving methodically, his mind perhaps empty of thought, or perhaps full of quiet worries known only to him. In another room, you picture a child practicing letters on a wax tablet, the stylus scratching softly as he copies words given by a tutor who corrects him gently, and you think of how such education was a luxury far removed from the waiting and wandering of women like Livia, who learned only what life demanded, who counted coins by instinct rather than numerals on a tablet. You move on and imagine a dining room arranged for a private feast, low couches set in a semicircle, dishes of olives and honey cakes set out carefully, and beyond that, the faint sound of distant music, the strum of strings, the rhythm slow and meandering, not for dance, but for drifting thoughts. You note the smooth plaster walls painted in rich reds and deep blacks, their surfaces carrying scenes of myth, gods feasting nymphs at play, painted worlds so far from the labor of the streets that they feel like dreams even as you look at them. And you think of Livia, who might have stood once in the shadow of such a house, waiting for someone to emerge, her shawl drawn close, catching a glimpse of lantern light spilling from within, and wondering what such light might feel like from the inside. You walk further still, letting your mind wander through a private garden, beyond the house where gravel paths wind between sculpted hedges and statues stand in stillness, their stone eyes catching the moonlight. And you think of someone strolling here, slowly hands clasped behind their back, listening to the gentle splash of a fountain as they speak softly to a companion about philosophy or trade or the rising price of grain. In the stillness of that imagined night, you notice the contrast not as a sharp edge, but as a slow gradient, a shift in air, a change in scent, a soft layering of two worlds side by side. You think of how in the city's rhythm, the footsteps of slaves and prostitutes and merchants and senators all mingle in the same dust, how the smoke from a poor woman's lamp and the smoke from a villa's brazier drift upward into the same dark sky. You let that thought settle unhurried as you picture yourself stepping out of the grand house, walking slowly back down the hill, passing through the shadow of high walls, and then back into the cramped quarters where the ruins you know so well lie sleeping under centuries. The elite have their mosaics, their fountains, their painted walls, but you think of how fleeting it all is, how those same walls now crumble, how those same mosaics now lie hidden under layers of earth, how their names fade until they are no more remembered than Livia's. And in that thought, there is a gentle comfort, because all those lives, no matter how gilded or rough, fall into the same quiet night. You keep walking your sandals whispering against the imagined stone. Your breath slowed the air carrying with it the mingled scents of olive oil, damp earth, faint smoke. You glance up to the sky, where the moon hangs steady, and you feel the rhythm of the city, old and new, moving together. The faint hum of voices in your memory merging with distant modern ones, and you realize that the contrast between rich and poor, between celebrated and forgotten, is softened by time into something calm, almost tender, as if the earth itself has taken all these stories and folded them gently together. You find yourself slowing, letting your body relax into the thought that the city holds everyone. In the end, that the marble and the plaster, the shawl and the silk, the feast and the crust of bread all meet in the same dust, the same patient soil. You sit again on a low step at the edge of this imagined world, letting your head rest lightly against the wall behind you. And you breathe in deeply, letting the scents and sounds blur, letting the images of lanterns and ruins fade together. Your eyelids grow heavy as you picture one last contrast, a villa roof catching the moonlight, and somewhere far below, a cramped room where a woman curls on her side, counting her breaths in the dark. Two lives, two places, separated by wealth and status, yet both wrapped now in the same night, the same city, the same quiet hum of history that lulls you even now into stillness and rest. You sit there longer, letting the picture in your mind expand, moving slowly from one detail to another, as though strolling through layers of time, and you think about how the elite arrange their lives with such care, their homes carefully aligned to catch the afternoon breeze, their gardens planted with herbs, not just for cooking, but for the softening of air and the easing of mood, and how each step of their day was cushioned by others. Labor, unseen hands, sweeping tiles, preparing bread, tending lamps so the light would never falter. You sit longer with these thoughts, feeling them grow softer, heavier, like a blanket laid over your shoulders, and you realize that the city itself has always been a cradle of opposites. Wealth and want, comfort and struggle, silence and noise. But in the stillness of night, all those opposites dissolve into a steady hum. A song of lives layered and fading. A song you can feel in your chest if you sit quietly enough. You let yourself breathe deeply, inhaling the scent of imagined laurel and distant smoke and damp stone, exhaling slowly until your shoulders drop, until your heartbeat slows to match the rhythm of those quiet lives. The city rests now in your mind as one whole, high and low, bright and dim, and you rest with it, lulled by the thought that even those who lived in shadow were part of something vast. Even those who dined under golden ceilings were in the end folded into the same soil, and the contrast that once felt sharp is now nothing more than a gentle echo fading into the night. You remain on that imagined step, letting the contrast roll over you in quiet waves, and after a time, you rise again in your mind and walk through another villa that rises somewhere above the dark tangle of narrow streets. A villa where a large doorway opens onto a hall lined with statues of ancestors whose eyes seem to watch even in shadow. Their faces carved with calm dignity, their marble brows catching the faint shimmer of lamplight. You trail your fingers along the edge of a marble table and feel how smooth it is compared to the rough wood Livia might rest her hand upon at night, and you imagine the sound of wine being poured into glass so thin it sings when tapped, and then you hear in your memory the duller sound of wine sloshing into a clay cup. Its rim chipped its surface gritty, and the two sounds blend in your ears until you can no longer tell which belongs to wealth and which to want. You wander further and enter a room where a scribe sits cross-legged, copying texts with deliberate patience, the stylus scratching softly on wax, and you think of the women in the streets who know no letters, who read only the tone of a voice, the curve of a hand gesture, and yet both forms of reading carry meaning. Both are ways to move through the world. You look up and see a ceiling painted with scenes of myth, a procession of figures frozen mid-gesture robes, flowing faces serene, and you think of the ceilings in cramped rooms, flaking plaster revealing old repairs. Yet those rough ceilings also tell stories. If you look closely, cracks, branching like rivers, stains marking old leaks. Each flaw a chapter in the life of that room. You step into a colonnaded garden where the night air feels softer, where the shadows of cypress trees fall in long shapes across the tiled ground, and you imagine a man pacing here in thought, debating the future of Rome in his mind. And then you picture Livia walking slowly back to her room, her steps deliberate as she counts her coins, debating not the fate of an empire, but the fate of her own next meal. And somehow those two worries feel linked, both born of living within the currents of a restless city. The air smells different here, heavier with the sweetness of crushed laurel leaves, and distant kitchens roasting meats that most people in the streets below might only smell but never taste. The floors are tiled in mosaics, whole and unbroken, smooth beneath sandaled feet, and you see the footprints of household slaves padding quietly through shadowed corridors, carrying trays with careful hands, their movements practiced and unobtrusive. You picture a woman of wealth reclining on a low couch, the fabric beneath her rich and dyed, deep her bracelets catching the flicker of the lamps, as she turns her wrist to pluck a fig from a shallow dish, her mind perhaps wandering through idle thoughts as she listens to a poet reciting verses in the next room, his voice steady and unhurried, the words spilling like warm honey in the heavy air. You continue and find yourself in a storage room of the villa, lined with amphorae, marked carefully with wax seals, each labeled with neat symbols for oil, for grain, for wine, and you think of the small jars in the lower streets, unmarked, holding whatever could be saved, and you realize both are gestures of preservation, both acts of care in their own way. You imagine the villa's kitchen, where fish sizzles on a brazier, herbs thrown in with a practiced hand, the rich smell filling the air. And then imagine the tavern's kitchen with its heavy pot of cabbage and beans simmering slowly. The scent earthier, sharper, but just as nourishing to those who gather around. You move to another room where the villa's mistress sits at a table sorting through fabrics, smooth linen and bright wool from distant lands. And you picture Livia mending the edge of her stola with clumsy stitches, drawing the needle through thick cloth, squinting in the poor light. And yet both acts are about maintaining what one has, about stretching the life of a garment as far as it will go. You wander through the imagined villa until you reach a balcony that overlooks the city, the air cool and faintly perfumed by night flowers in pots, and from here you can see the glow of countless lamps below, a constellation of ordinary lives twinkling faintly, and you imagine the woman on the balcony watching those lights without really thinking of them, unaware of the rooms hidden behind each glow, unaware of the quiet routine beneath. And you realize that Livia too might once have looked up toward these heights, her own lamp flickering in the darkness, wondering vaguely what it would be like to live behind those high walls, and then shrugging the thought away as she returned to her bread, her coins, her straw mattress. You let that dual image settle in your mind, two women separated by walls and wealth, both breathing the same night air, both thinking their own private thoughts, both unnoticed by history, except as faint shadows glimpsed in records or ruins. The more you dwell on it, the softer the contrast becomes, like ink bleeding gently across old parchment, until it is no longer about envy or privilege, but simply about the wide range of human existence folded into the same place. You keep walking in your mind, passing through one last wide hall lined with bronze lamps, and you notice how the shadows cluster in the corners, despite the light, how even here there are patches of darkness untouched, and you think of the dark corners in narrow insulae where lamps barely glow, and the similarity feels comforting. A reminder that no light is complete and no shadow is unique. You step outside and walk down the slope again, past the guarded gates and the stone posts, past the merchants' stalls, now closed, past the faint smell of old cooking fires. And as you descend the streets, narrow, and the stones become uneven. And soon, you are once more in the world where Livia lived, where a single window glows softly behind a shutter, where someone shifts in their sleep on straw, where a jar of water sits on a shelf ready for morning. You pause in that imagined street, letting the weight of the hill behind you and the weight of the rooms ahead of you blend into one, and you feel yourself carried by the quiet knowledge that both worlds are gone, now both dissolved into the same earth, and yet both linger in the stones, in the shards, in the faint lines on ancient walls, waiting to be felt by anyone who walks slowly enough, listens carefully enough, breathes deeply enough to hear the heartbeat of a city that never truly sleeps. And you stand there, eyes half closed, your breath slow and even, and you feel a calm wash over you, as if those countless lives, high and low, rich and poor, loud and quiet, have gathered around you in silence, holding you in the same timeless rhythm that soothed them long ago. You walk further into this imagined domus, noting the polished bronze mirrors leaning on low tables, the soft rustle of woven curtains shifting as the breeze moves through the inner courtyard, and you think of how very far this life is from the one you traced in the ruins, though the distance is measured in only a few streets. The same city holds them both layered, not in miles, but in fortunes and privileges that feel almost invisible to those who have them. You pause near an imagined atrium, the roof open to the night, rainwater collected in a square basin, the reflection of the moon shimmering on its surface, and you picture a slave kneeling to clean the tiles, his hands moving methodically, his mind perhaps empty of thought, or perhaps full of quiet worries known only to him. In another room, you picture a child practicing letters on a wax tablet, the stylus scratching softly as he copies words given by a tutor who corrects him gently, and you think of how such education was a luxury far removed from the waiting and wandering of women like Livia, who learned only what life demanded, who counted coins by instinct rather than numerals on a tablet. You move on and imagine a dining room arranged for a private feast, low couches set in a semicircle, dishes of olives and honey cakes set out carefully, and beyond that, the faint sound of distant music, the strum of strings, the rhythm slow and meandering, not for dance, but for drifting thoughts. You note the smooth plaster walls painted in rich reds and deep blacks, their surfaces carrying scenes of myth, gods feasting nymphs at play, painted worlds so far from the labor of the streets that they feel like dreams even as you look at them. And you think of Livia, who might have stood once in the shadow of such a house, waiting for someone to emerge, her shawl drawn close, catching a glimpse of lantern light spilling from within, and wondering what such light might feel like from the inside. You walk further still, letting your mind wander through a private garden, beyond the house where gravel paths wind between sculpted hedges, and statues stand in stillness, their stone eyes catching the moonlight. And you think of someone strolling here, slowly hands clasped behind their back, listening to the gentle splash of a fountain, as they speak softly to a companion about philosophy or trade or the rising price of grain. In the stillness of that imagined night, you notice the contrast not as a sharp edge, but as a slow gradient, a shift in air, a change in scent, a soft layering of two worlds side by side. You think of how in the city's rhythm, the footsteps of slaves and prostitutes and merchants and senators all mingle in the same dust, how the smoke from a poor woman's lamp and the smoke from a villa's brazier drift upward into the same dark sky. You let that thought settle unhurried as you picture yourself stepping out of the grand house, walking slowly back down the hill, passing through the shadow of high walls, and then back into the cramped quarters where the ruins you know so well lie sleeping under centuries. The elite have their mosaics, their fountains, their painted walls. But you think of how fleeting it all is, how those same walls now crumble, how those same mosaics now lie hidden under layers of earth, how their names fade until they are no more remembered than Livia's. And in that thought, there is a gentle comfort, because all those lives, no matter how gilded or rough, fall into the same quiet night. You keep walking your sandals whispering against the imagined stone. Your breath slow the air carrying with it, the mingled scents of olive oil, damp earth, faint smoke. You glance up to the sky, where the moon hangs steady, and you feel the rhythm of the city, old and new, moving together. The faint hum of voices in your memory merging with distant modern ones, and you realize that the contrast between rich and poor, between celebrated and forgotten, is softened by time into something calm, almost tender, as if the earth itself has taken all these stories and folded them gently together. You find yourself slowing, letting your body relax into the thought that the city holds everyone. In the end, that the marble and the plaster, the shawl and the silk, the feast and the crust of bread all meet in the same dust, the same patient soil. You sit again on a low step at the edge of this imagined world, letting your head rest lightly against the wall behind you. And you breathe in deeply, letting the scents and sounds blur, letting the images of lanterns and ruins fade together. Your eyelids grow heavy as you picture one last contrast, a villa roof catching the moonlight, and somewhere far below, a cramped room where a woman curls on her side, counting her breaths in the dark. Two lives, two places, separated by wealth and status, yet both wrapped now in the same night, the same city, the same quiet hum of history that lulls you even now into stillness and rest. You sit there longer, letting the picture in your mind expand, moving slowly from one detail to another, as though strolling through layers of time, and you think about how the elite arrange their lives with such care, their homes carefully aligned to catch the afternoon breeze, their gardens planted with herbs, not just for cooking, but for the softening of air and the easing of mood, and how each step of their day was cushioned by others. Labor, unseen hands, sweeping tiles, preparing bread, tending lamps so the light would never falter.